Good morning, everyone. A very, very warm welcome. Many thanks to our panelists. Many thanks to everyone who's registering for today's Localis webinar. Please release me, delivering public land for house building. My name's Jonathan Wareham. I'm the Chief Executive at Localis. As a think tank obsessed, concerned with place and radical localism, it's fair to say recent years and the last few years haven't been necessarily a golden age for central local relations. Perhaps less said the better in some cases, but we have an exception in the one public estate where we have a successful value-creating collaboration between the Cabinet Office, the Local Government Association, individual local authorities that creates fresh possibilities for the good, the beneficial, the useful, and the economically, the financially, and the socially profitable. So we're going to debate this today in our event, Delivering Public Land for House Building, Please Release Me. And this event's been supported by Localis' corporate member, Wilmot Dixon, as part of our ongoing Building for Renewal series of webinars in which we're examining what and how a housing-led recovery could and should look like. So to do this today, we've got very grateful for our top panel of speakers we've assembled to discuss the issue. Who we got? We've got Michael O'Doherty, Programme Manager for Local Partnerships. From the Local Government Association, we've got Ellen Vernon, Programme Director for One Public Estate, joined with her colleague from Cabinet Office's One Public Estate from the Government Property Unit, Kirsty Reillard. And finally, we got Richard Sterling, National Development Manager at Wilmot Dixon. So the very simple, straightforward event today. We want to be examining the role of the One Public Estate programme in unlocking surplus land nationwide for house building. So in terms of what we're aiming to look at today, kind of three kind of key focuses of debate. How can the Land Release Fund best support authorities to release land at pace for house building, often given the impetus of last week's Queen's speech and the housing and planning reforms coming down the track. In terms of the local state, what should local government do as place leaders to shape housing opportunities in their area through using this programme? And how at kind of central government, at kind of public estate level, could central government departments consider their own estate needs in a way that supports local renewal with an eye to specific place and market dynamics? So that's kind of what we're looking at today. How are we going to do it? Well, the format's very simple and straightforward. First up, the lines share the presentation. We'll give over to Ellen and Kirsty to set really the context for One Public Estate. Very grateful for having both of you here to present jointly, and they'll also talk about the recently announced Brownfield Land Release Fund. Next up, we'll hear from Michael O'Doherty at Local Partnerships to get their views about what's going on. And finally, Richard Sterling from Wilmot Dixon will round off the panel to give a developer view. Once the presentations are done, we'll then unpick some of the issues that are raised amongst ourselves and cordially invite members of the audience, lob in your questions in the Q&A box if you can. We'll try and fish them out from the chat, but the Q&A is where we prefer to find the answers. As with all our Localis events, we'll be kind of keeping a running track of this on Twitter. For those who want to follow it, the hashtag today is, you can see it, OPE, hashtag OPE housing. Got that? And there'll be further instructions in the chat box to take us through. Anyway, we've got plenty of time to discuss the key issues at stake. And without too much further ado, if I can kindly invite Ellen and Kirsty to unmic and share your presentation, we'll get on with the show. Thank you.
Thanks, Jonathan. Really nice to be here this morning. As Jonathan said, Ellen and I are both OP programme directors. We share that job. We just sit on different sides of the team. So I'm on the Cabinet Office side, Ellen is on the Local Government Association side. And I'm just trying to share my screen, Jonathan, but it's not allowing me to do so at the moment for the presentation.
Let's see what we can do.
This is always the way, isn't it? The first time you'll try and do something technical on a webinar. Don't worry, everyone. Jonathan has the slides as a backup as well. So if I get stuck, we can do this.
Try
right.
it? No, I think I've.
Let me just. Let me try again. I don't think it's going to let me do it on my system, unfortunately, Jonathan. That's probably Cabinet Office preferences to allow to deny. So could I ask
you to have a quick go?
Yeah, Ellen, if you would, that would be great. This is always typical, isn't it? That's government restrictions on what we can and can't do for IT, unfortunately. Great.
Okay, so I think we've probably done introductions, and I'll kick off with the first slide for you, Kirsty.
Perfect, thanks, Ellen. So just to give you a bit of context and where we come from on One Public Estates, we started back in 2013. So this was a partnership, as I've just outlined, between Office of Government Property and the Cabinet Office and the Local Government Association. And really that's the sort of premise of what we're trying to do, as Jonathan outlined, that sort of collaboration across the public sector can't just be at the local level, it has to be at that national level. And that's why we decided and we built that programme together between those two organisations, and it has lasted nearly 7-8 years now, so we must be doing something right. So our aim, as we set out in the beginning, was to support that collaboration across the public sector on property projects, and we would do that with a little bit of revenue funding and with support and specialist skills as well. And from 12 pilot areas back in 2013-14, we have expanded to 72 strategic partnerships across England. So those range from unitary authorities like Cornwall up to big devolution areas such as Manchester Combined Authority, with wider public sectors playing a really key role within those strategic partnerships. We work with 96% of English local authorities. So we have really good relationships across the country. And we work with about 13 main government departments, everybody from DWP, Home Office, MOD, right down to DCMS, for example, and more specific projects. And we also have a huge collection and work with hundreds of wider public sector partners as we deliver the programme as well. So Blue Lights, Health Partners, for example. In 2017, we expanded our strategic partnership and went into business, as you like, with the Ministry for Housing, Communities and Local Government. And I'll say a little bit about the Land Release Fund in a second. But for OPE, we have secured 8 application rounds of funding over the time that we've been going. And that's, as we said at the beginning, is revenue funding and support. So a little bit of support, a little bit of funding to kickstart some of the projects that may be difficult to get over the line, may need to do some preliminary work before business cases are put together, and to de-risk some of those as well. And we actually have over 700 live projects on the programme, so not counting the ones that have closed and delivered to date. So huge, vast programme of work that's delivered by our partnerships on the ground. So as I said, we went into partnership with CLG, and particularly that was around housing and supporting what was then and continues to be a high priority agenda for government, both central and local, building the houses that we need to. That strategic partnership resulted in what we have called the Land Release Fund. And we have delivered 2 phases so far, and that started in 2018. And that's capital funding for major infrastructure works to release local authority land suitable for housing. We particularly look at smaller sites with the Land Release Fund with a viability gap. So this isn't that land is going to be developed out, it's going to be delivered. It's where there is an unviable site and where that funding and support can unlock something to be delivered. And we've supported about 140 projects so far. At the moment, and we'll come back to this later, we have the Brownfield Land Release Fund, which is actually open for applications. It's our biggest fund to date. There's £75 million worth of funding available in capital. 25 million of that is ring fence for self and custom built, and I'll also come back to that point as well. But really the crux of this is about supporting those complex and specific sites that have their particular challenges related to housing delivery and seeing how we can get them over the line. So really two halves of the programme there, but as one, we call that one public estate. And I just want to touch on the benefits of the programme because it's worth just recognising the scale and significance. So I was trying to do some early calculations a bit earlier on about how much we've invested to date. And I think that's probably around the 60 to 70 million pounds worth in one public estate. So you can see the value for money and what we've been able to derive in terms of delivery only to date. So all of that investment can range from projects delivering over maybe a 3-year period right out to 10 years as well. So already we're seeing 416 million in capital receipts, over 30,000 jobs created, nearly 20,000 homes being or land for homes being released on public sector sites. And don't forget the running cost savings as well, 87 million pounds worth of efficiencies over that time and growing. So there's a huge amount that is within our programme going to be delivered over the next few years as well. So just going on to the next one, just to explain a little bit about one public estate and the Land Release Fund. And I think sometimes from the outside it can feel like they're a little bit disjointed. They're absolutely not. And we worked with CLG in terms of that priority area of housing to understand how we could better support particularly smaller sites where Homes England or CLG programmes weren't delivering the funding or weren't targeting those areas where we could support as a programme. That is also particularly around the pipeline. So one public estate, as I've said, looks out to that sort of 10-year period, and it looks at the very early stages of project support and funding, so feasibility, master planning, surveying, etc. So really understanding what the potential and opportunity is, thinking about all of those different public sector partners, releasing land, co-locating services, then maybe thinking about housing and what they can build out on them. The Land Release Fund obviously looks at those housing sites specifically, but that is also building that longer term pipeline. So one public estate building the longer term pipeline, Land Release Fund building the short term delivery pipeline. So thinking about allowing that capital funding to release the land that has already been identified but is unviable for a particular reason. And just to talk a little bit about how we do this and what one public estate actually means in practice. Well, this is probably the sort of high level way of explaining it. So we started back in 2013. Really, it was about convening those public sector partners to recognise what the opportunity might be. And to do that, we need to map what those public sector assets are. So all of those partners around the table, what is the opportunity? What's that scale? We don't know unless we can actually see that in data terms. We're still doing that. That hasn't stopped. It's not something that we can do once and then lead from there, but we have been able to create a better awareness and understanding through those partnerships about what's on the ground. There is still more to do, don't get me wrong, and the data and the technology, and that's something that the wider Office of Government Property is looking at the moment in terms of data sharing as well. But really using that data, that information, those opportunities to build that shared vision and programme, to bid into the programme, to recognise what that opportunity is, to align objectives, to align timescales as much as possible, because that is a difficulty, and then deliver that project and help develop out what those proposals are. So just in terms of the OP offer, we have professional support, we have a range of people with skills and experiences across the programme. So we obviously have a Cabinet Office and LGA side of our team and work very closely with CLG policy teams and more widely across government. So we have access to broader teams, broader policy areas, and understanding of how we can provide intelligence, provide information to develop that policy and to develop funds as well. And that's what we saw with the local, the Land Release Fund as well. That support and that sort of professional skills, it's there's a broad range across the programme, and actually we have some people who've joined the Cabinet Office side who've worked in local government and vice versa as well, and some professional skills across the team to boot. For us, the USP of OP is about neutral brokerage, so it's working in between partners, not having the skin in the game that perhaps Homes England does, or private sector investment, for example. We have a very neutral role in trying to find a compromise in terms of getting a collaborative approach and getting the best opportunity away. We do give funding, but we also have things like opportunities workshops and sharing of best practice to make sure that we can really recognise some of those challenges and overcome them as well. Partner benefits. So obviously we're looking at the release of surplus public land, homes, jobs, regeneration schemes. We're looking at efficiency savings. We really want to create better services as well. And then that's linked in with creating efficiency through that and being more effective at delivery. And it's a really key area for our Minister, Lord Agnew, in terms of public services. The citizen doesn't really mind which organisation provides that service, they just want that service. So we need to be better and more aligned at providing that across the public sector. As I've said, we're targeting the early stages of that project development so that we can de-risk those projects. We can provide a little bit of upfront funding to do that. And we've got a range of themes which Ellen will go into, which is around unlocking demand for housing, public services, but we're also thinking now on economic recovery, service redesign and sustainability. And I guess that's the bottom of this page is really key. It's about using property as an enabler for service delivery, for example, and a range of other benefits as well. And I think the next slide is just my last one, and that's really to touch on some of the common challenges that we see not only across this programme, but across other policy areas that we're trying to support with in our patch. So part of that is about diversifying the housing market. So we very much support small medium enterprises. We have done a lot of work with modern methods of construction and supporting SMEs to deliver that as well. I've talked very much about small sites and the ability to support a different or a more focused view and a more focused fund on some of those smaller and difficult sites as well. And of course, through the Brownfield Land Release Fund, we're looking at self and custom build as well. I think some of the others around town centre repurposing, Helen. So we've got the opportunity really now. And I think particularly through COVID, people are going back to their local high streets. We have the opportunity, particularly around public sector assets that are often in those places, to repurpose and reuse them and to create that local community again. And just touching on a couple of these things, not all of them. We have a lot of health projects across our programme. We are really keen to support the integration of that care system, so social care, health, really thinking how we can support our health partners and local partners. To do that, it can be very challenging. It is very challenging. There are a few buzzwords on here like levelling up. I'm sure people will still be wondering exactly what it means, but it's not just about a north and a south divide. It's about supporting every area of the country to be to help them to be better, to level up the country in terms of how they can deliver, and we can support them to do that. And I would just say a little bit about the pace of delivery and local authority capacity for us is about helping opportunities come to the fore quickly, that is partly how we work with partners on the ground and our relationships that we've built with them. And it's partly about accessing the right people at the right time and thinking about the future funds that some of these projects that are coming through OPE might go on to secure funding for as well. But that goes hand in hand with capacity and capability around skills and expertise. So we have, and I haven't mentioned the pool of experts, which allows us to parachute people in with the certain skills and expertise if they're missing in certain partnerships, just for a short stint to get them over the line and develop their projects out. I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to hand over to Ellen to take us through some of the projects that we deliver.
Thanks, Kirsty. And as Kirsty has mentioned, we very much respond to local needs. We don't have any one size fits all. We don't prescribe what a project should be. It's all about public property being an enabler. So 700 plus projects in our portfolio at the moment, and we've got all manner of different things, but I just thought I'd pick out some key themes that we have. So we do a lot of public service hubs, but they can take all sorts of different shapes and forms. So I always like our Corsham example, which has got a neighbourhood policing team co-located in a leisure centre, quite an unusual and innovative project. That was one of our earlier ones, but just shows how two different working cultures can share a space well together. The Mildenhall hub is one that people may be aware of. It's one of our biggest hubs, and in this one we've got an academy, a library. It's literally in construction at the moment, and I think ribbon's due to be cut in a few weeks. So we've got an academy, we've got a library, we've got children's services in here, we've got DWP delivering services, and we've got leisure services as well. So pretty much the full range, apart from policing, of everything you have in terms of public services in that one flagship project. We also work on more complex town centre regeneration projects, station regeneration. A couple of projects just to pull out: Plymouth and York, where we've used OP funding to bring partners together at the really early stage exploration to set up partnerships to explore where partners adjoining land can be used to support stations as gateways and wider town centre regeneration. They've each got slightly different partners involved. In Plymouth, it's GWR, Great Western Rail, Network Rail, the university and the City Council, and in York there's Homes England also involved in that partnership. Same principles in both. It's about making sure the partners are set up and established in the right kind of formation where they're comfortable to be sharing information and exploring options at the early stage, and also providing one public estate funding for some of that early exploration and master planning work. And then the other kind of interesting category potentially to attendees today is where we work or facilitate MOD and local authorities to work together, looking at repurposing the defence estate. So two quite different examples here. The Whitehill and Borden example in Hampshire is all about what does the new town centre look like in the new town, and what happens to the public services which are currently being delivered in, or have been delivered in, some disparate sites in the old town centre, and bringing them together in a hub in the new town. And the second one, the Rutland project, don't want to talk about this one too much because I know it's a little bit controversial at the moment, but the OP support here was all about developing that core relationship between the MOD and the local authority in the first instance, so that the local authority could play in their expertise in terms of working with communities and consultation and kicking off that master planning process. I'm now going to dive into two more case studies in a little bit more detail. I love this one. It's one public estate project in Wareham, Dorset, and I love it because it's so quick and so simple. So we provided funding in April 2019. Those units were occupied in August 2020. That is one of the speediest projects in my kind of 15 or so years of working in councils and public sector I've seen. So the objective here was providing more appropriate supported housing for individuals to free up space in residential care and to free up hospital beds. And Dorset Council had a surplus school site. It was quite a large site, and it is still coming forwards for a wider, more complex development. But in the meantime, the concept here was to basically use some of the school site as meanwhile space, use some MMC units so they're relocatable. In time they will move to somewhere else to do the same thing, and these 18 units are used to provide supported housing for specialist uses. It includes accessible accommodation in there as well. So really successful project, and clearly some wider benefits here. The key benefit is obviously providing that housing, but actually it's also about regeneration, visual impact, releasing the space in the other beds, and so on and so forth. So that, like I said, that's my favourite OPE project, I think, that I like to talk about. Then, just to give you a contrast, we've talked about the Land Release Fund as well. And this is my favourite Land Release Fund project to talk about because it's got graffiti on it and lovely design. So the objective here was Brighton and Hove have particular housing challenges, high levels of population growth, obviously a constrained area in terms of development sites and options. Brighton had 3 former car parking sites, each in themselves quite small, but actually potential to join those up and create a small housing site. An issue as well in terms of streetscape and crime. As you can see from the top photograph, it attracted a level of antisocial behaviour. It was also a constrained site and ultimately needed 35 party wall agreements to bring it forwards. We provided not a great deal of money actually for this one, 144,000, to cover those abnormal costs that were meaning this was difficult to bring forward in the normal course of business for the local authority. So our funding was used to support some of the very specialist advice and approach to the party wall agreements, but also some groundworks and contamination work. And this project has seen 12 new council homes come forward, and it won an award for its best architectural design a couple of years ago. So that's 2 kind of live examples of how OPE and LRF work on the ground. What I'm just going to move on to, Kirsty has really helpfully trailed as well that we have a current funding round open, the Brownfield Land Release Fund. So a 75 million pot of funding, capital. 50 million of this is for local authority owned brownfield sites that are suitable for housing, but where there are viability issues, meaning that's too challenging to come forwards in the general course of business. So that funding needs to address that market failure. We're looking at smaller sites. So Homes England, as I'm sure most attendees will be aware, sort of lead on lots of the bigger development sites. Our funding is for the smaller opportunities, and we're asking that sites are able to release those, be available for housing development by 2024. Alongside that, we have something new, and people may have seen in the media recently quite a lot of focus at the moment in terms of diversifying the housing market and providing more options for individuals to be able to become property owners, homeowners themselves, and a lot of emphasis on self and custom build opportunities. And local authorities are being supported by the opportunity of bidding into the £25 million pot for self and custom build sites. And projects here can include greenfield sites as well as brownfield sites. Again, it's about addressing viability issues, but it's also about being able to provide funding for servicing to enable plots to come forwards. So a few examples of what viability issues might be and what costs might be, so that people are aware of that. And I'm going too fast again, apologies. I will just to make the point that we've got a couple of weeks left for that funding, 2 weeks left for the bidding window. So if you haven't already, really urge you to consider that if you've got sites in your locality that might be suitable for funding. Right, I will click on the right button at some point. Apologies, everyone. So we just wanted to conclude our sort of conversation on One Public Estate with a few reflections. So maybe responding to some of your points in your brief, Jonathan, and just having a think about kind of what works well, why we're a programme that's still in existence after 8 years. That's a long time for a programme to still be going. So what is it that's working well? Kirsty's made this point earlier. I think we feel a really important strength is the fact that we are neutral brokers. We we have no interest ultimately in what that project looks like, or whether it's seeking to deliver land for housing, whether it's focused on improving public services or whatever. So we're able to approach our projects and provide our support really neutrally, and often act as mediators where there are divergent views between different partners. We, again, the point's been made, I think, but our flexibility of our approach, it's all about what that locality needs and applying public estate as an enabler. The fact that we're able to provide a pipeline of housing, or the one public estate is able to provide a pipeline of land for housing, so releasing surplus land that can then be used for housing, that's a very successful flow through revenue funding to unlock the estate, and then capital to actually bring that forward. And not just about housing and saving funds and capital receipts and revenue savings, there are wider values from repurposing public land as well. It's about the regeneration impact, it's about improving the general environment for people, their overall quality of life, as per the Brighton example, reducing ASB, improving civic pride, and so on. And just what are our key learnings? Again, I think responding to some of your questions, Jonathan, what would we suggest people do if we were setting this up from the beginning? What's our advice to partners? I think we've had several rounds of funding for both One Public Estate and LRF. And certainly, I think our key piece of advice for local authorities is the value in keeping a pipeline of potential projects that you can bring forward. And our teams kind of are out in the field supporting local authorities to do that. We've made the points as well about capacity, and we're able to assist and provide access to the pool of experts. But actually, one of our key learnings is recommending investing in that capacity at the early stage in order to plan and to plot out your project. I think another learning is don't dismiss the value of smaller sites. They can be difficult and time consuming, but there are different opportunities to work with neighbours, to wrap them up into a portfolio, to secure some capacity perhaps to project manage a portfolio of small sites. So it can make small pieces of land quite achievable in terms of bringing them forward for housing, or realising them for capital receipts, and so on. I think fundamentally at the heart of what we do, one of our learnings is it's about having a really open conversation, sharing data and information and ambitions at an early stage. So particularly where we're talking about maybe some of the bigger projects, so MOD sites working with local authorities, hospitals working with local authorities, don't be shy. If you've got a particular objective, you want to release this site because of, having that early conversation with a local authority will really help to plot the course through the planning process. And again, I think the message is talk to those in local government where they've got expertise in terms of working with communities and establishing the planning policies at the early stages. Far easier to do that when local plans are being developed rather than trying to retrofit through development briefs and so on later. I think one of our other reflections is you can spend a long time on a complex project trying to get it perfect. Things can change in the meantime. I think COVID has certainly shown us that. So I think one of our key messages would be go for good or very good rather than trying to go for perfect. Better to have a good project that has flexibility where you could kind of add to it later, rather than something that you're trying to tie down so tightly it actually becomes quite difficult then when the world changes a little bit. And finally, I made this point a bit earlier, co-locations can work. So I think certainly in the early days, we found a lot of partners reluctant to share space. There are cultural differences between different kind of employers, whether that's local authorities or police or DWP. Those co-locations can work. Have those early conversations. Everybody can share security access and so on and so forth. So just to land that point. And then just to bring us to a close. So what are we doing next? Where does One Public Estate go next? So we've got 700 odd projects on our books. We've developed lots of experience as we've moved forward over the years. One of the things that we're looking for going forwards is how do we best extract the value from our learnings and build on those and how do we play a role, or how does public estate play a role in system change? So we're starting to explore avenues there. So how can we embed some of our experience, for example, housing, health and councils working together? And then I think the second point just to make in terms of our forward look is that we're thinking about the role of public land and how that best supports public service transformation in our post-COVID world. So citizens have become used to digital services over the last year. You know, that's been accelerated hugely. How do we maximize the opportunities from that? And also, how do we address some of the challenges we know we're going to have in our post-COVID world? So particularly in terms of town centres, for example, what are the opportunities for public services where they are being provided face-to-face to be located sort of right in the middle, in the heart of town centres, to support footfall, for example? So bit of a canter through with some case studies and some reflections. And I think just to end, a couple of contact details there. So if you are interested in the Brownfield Land Release Fund or the Self and Custom Build support, please do have a look at our web pages, which give you some detailed information about that. And if you're in doubt about anything, please do get in touch. And I think other speakers are going to come first, but as and when we get to the questions, really happy to take any questions or reflections. I think it's really important to say that we are also in listening mode here. So really interested to know, what are the challenges for public sector partners at the moment? Where do you see the role of public estate going forwards? Thank you.
Okay, I think that's over to me. So thank you, Ellen. Michael O'Doherty, I'm a project director at Local Partnerships. And for those of you that don't know Local Partnerships, we are a public sector owned support agency. We're owned by Her Majesty's Government, HM Treasury, the LGA and the Welsh Government. And we only provide support services, advisory services to other public sector services across a range of areas, particularly in relation to energy. I work in the housing and regeneration team, infrastructure, waste and recycling, a whole range of areas. I also spent 4 years working with the One Public Estate programme as a regional programme manager. So from my perspective, to be able to talk very briefly, just to reiterate, I suppose, a lot of the points that Kirsty and Ellen have already made, but particularly thinking from an OP and housing perspective. I mean, the context of this for me, as has already been set out, but it's really important, is this emerging policy framework, levelling up, decarbonisation, Brexit, digital kind of wider infrastructure strategy, and automation, and trying to understand how these various kind of policy frameworks, but also the funding frameworks that have come together, and in some cases quite significant funds that have been put forward, but how will actually they work in practice? And I suppose one of the points that I'd make is that One Public Estate and the partnerships that have been built up over the 5 or 6 years provide a really good opportunity for local authorities to work collaboratively, to share some of the kind of the learning, but also to share some of the risks associated with doing some of this work as well. What I will say, and maybe in a position to be able to say that more difficult for Ellen and Kirsty, is that it's really important that these funding programs, they come through in a kind of a clear and a coherent way, and less about competitive funding, more about planned approach, giving opportunity to local authorities and wider public sector partners the opportunity to prepare plans for an area, and certainly then to start to have a pipeline of projects and bring those together. From a regional perspective, that's one of the things we were asked to look at. Clearly the shift over the last couple of years is that previously a lot of the housing programs and to an extent the Land Release Fund was very much focused on affordability, and so that did tend to make that things like land release were more prioritised for those areas that had very high funding affordability gaps, tended to be more in the south. I think with levelling up, clearly there's just as much a kind of question around viability and making sure that infrastructure, if you like, in some of the areas in the north and some of the less kind of economically strong areas are also getting supported with these programs. But it's understanding how these will work together. Absolutely agree Ellen's point about town centres, there's a real opportunity there, but there's a real risk there, isn't there, in terms of what they look like in the future, what the demand will be for office space. How do we bring together existing public services, public estates, but also maybe looking at how local authorities and other public sector partners can assemble sites that maybe they won't have the opportunity to do in 5-10 years. So maybe now is an opportunity to look at some of that. But also we talked about how we work with other groups, community assets, how there's a more of a kind of a consolidated look at town centres. And again, I think one public estate is a really strong opportunity to be able to do that now. Civil service relocation, I think there was an announcement last year around 22,000 civil service jobs going out to the other parts of the country. So again, we're levelling up, a huge opportunity to think about those areas that are best able to support that relocation, but also would almost benefit from it as well. In terms of the wider opportunities and in terms of housing, and we obviously work with a lot of local authorities in terms of this particular agenda, big issues around delivery capacity and skills. So again, one public estate, I think there's as much about how do you share opportunities, share learning, and share some capacity to develop some of these programs. I think Homes England in recent years have directing their support, I think, to local authorities in a more joined up way. So I was pleased to see in the last couple of days there's a new kind of consolidated support framework for around local authorities for development. So if you kind of Google housing development support for local government for Homes England, you now get a whole kind of website and how their various tools are brought together. And I think that's something that's a step forward. And in there you'll see reference to the Land Release Fund as well from a MHCLG perspective. So I think that more joined up approach is really important. From a local authority perspective, developing a pipeline of sites, of projects, whether it's OPE or wider housing opportunities, is really important. But it's also one of the big gaps and challenges that we see. Local partnerships does a lot of work with local authorities and with combined authorities to prepare that pipeline, to look at the planning issues, other constraints, infrastructure constraints. And it comes back to the issue around skills and capacity within local authorities. It is a challenge at the moment. If you go broader, look at issues around materials, around skills in the construction sector as well. So there's some of the gaps that I think local authorities, again, through partnerships, could potentially look to try work with training organisations to ensure that locally there is more of an opportunity to have a skills, particularly around traditional construction, but also looking at things like modern methods of construction as well. I'll finish off by just, quick thought about one public estate. I mean, for me, it's a really important programme. As Kirsty says, it's lasted 7 or 8 years, and it doesn't last 7 or 8 years unless it's been doing really good work. It's important that part of the wider kind of toolkit of resources that local authorities can fall on in terms of housing development, but also in managing their own estate. What I would say is in recent years that the grant, the de-risking element of one public estate has become more stretched as more partnerships have come on board. So I think that's something that does need to be looked at. There is an introduction of these of loans. My own view is that to de-risk some of the more innovative projects, particularly around town centres where there's risk, I think it's important that that grant element is retained. I think the fact that you've got the really strong kind of barrier busting role within one public estate, and that traction, I think, within government departments is there, but I think it needs to be built on. I think there needs to be as much encouragement for some of the departments to release land, and it's difficult, isn't it, with COVID. Health, for example, at the moment there'll be questions around whether we can release more land, but I think that the more that there is that incentive internally, I think that's obviously going to help a programme such as this one. So I think I'm going to leave it there, give a chance for questions. Just to finish off by saying I think that the real value to me in one public estate is that aggregation, that collaboration, and working together to learn, but also to de-risk projects going forward.
Michael,
over to you.
Michael, many thanks indeed. For the view from local partnerships, I'm next going to invite Richard Sterling to unmic and give us the view from developer side. Over to you, Richard.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, thanks, Jonathan, and morning, everyone, and thanks to you and the Localis team for inviting me on this panel today with a great lineup of speakers. As Jonathan said, I'm Richard Sterling. I'm the National Head of Land and Development at Wilmot Dixon. We're a contractor who's also providing a suite of development services and solutions to public sector partners, ranging from local authorities, NHS trusts, education providers, and agencies such as Homes England, to really try and drive additional value from public sector assets, working alongside one public estate programs and other things like that. And, a huge part of what we do has been around accelerating house building programs. We as a business, we deliver over 1,000 homes a year, working alongside public sector partners. We're delivering right across the country from, Rotherham over to places such as Preston, Wigan, down to Bristol, over to the southeast as well, and everywhere in between. So a real track record for delivering homes. And so, yeah, on that theme, I was really delighted to come today and talk around how the private sector could support some of these one public estate agendas, really. And, from my perspective, the one public estate does provide a great opportunity to deliver and create a better future for people, which is ultimately what this is around, in accelerating house building and bringing efficiencies in estates. It's about benefiting people. And the one public estate programme brings that together in terms of adding greater quantity of output for all these issues, and I think that's a really positive step. And from the speakers today, we've heard some great plans that are ongoing and delivering some great work. And for me, I think there's a real opportunity to embrace how the private sector and the public sector can work together to really add to that and create a public sector asset base that's fit to deliver better and more prosperous communities. And I think that can be achieved by from all sides, really, adopting a slightly less parochial approach and creating a new mindset for the way we treat public estates and managed services. I think it was Ellen that mentioned, co-location of services and agencies can offer some great benefits, and it means you can achieve a lot more with less. So not only in terms of the efficiency savings, but it can enhance the amount of land that can be released to unlock housing by bringing multiple partners together to deliver a shared objective. At Wilmot Dixon, we worked with a range of one public estate initiatives now, and for me, we've picked up a number of areas that when these facets come together, they're more successful than others. So I think the first one, as Ellen mentioned, was about having organisations who've got a shared vision and everyone pulling in the same direction. I think equally important, one of the speakers mentioned, was around the principle of open and transparent dialogue, particularly when it comes to political drivers for each organisation. I think without that transparency, schemes are going to be having an uphill task from day one. And I think it's something that organisations shouldn't shy away from, is be open about what the drivers are for each entity. I think there's got to be a bit of give and take as well. For these schemes to be a success, it can't be just one organisation driving the agenda just to their own objectives. There's got to be a shared give and take to make sure all stakeholders get what they want out of it. And I think the other thing is about making sure whatever the objective is, it does have a real focus on delivering against local drivers, particularly in respect of releasing house building. And as I say, without any of those aspects, I think schemes do have an uphill task. And we have seen some great examples, just to add some of the case studies that Ellen and Kirsty ran through. At the moment, we're working with a group of bodies to create a new mental health community hub. So working with Oxford NHS Trust and Oxfordshire County Council, alongside two charities, to bring a real community hub together. And in doing so, that will release 2 parcels of land for housing. And without those multiple bodies coming together, it would have been probably a little bit more parochial in terms of how that land's released. But what's been key in that example is there's been absolute clarity from both the council and the NHS Trust around the political aims of the project. So yes, that's about creating efficiency, which is a huge driver for it, or quite an obvious one. But another big political driver in that scheme has been around releasing land for local housing need. In this instance, that's been around key affordable, key worker housing. And by having that clarity driven from the outset in the strategy, that's shaped how we've adopted bringing the business plan to fruition. So we've engaged with the local plan process to make sure planning policy can meet that strategic aim, and we've tried to bring planners in a lot earlier in that business plan process than perhaps we would have otherwise done. And I think having that proactive strategic approach is helping drive political buy-in to the project. I think that's absolutely critical, because without that political buy-in, these schemes are going to struggle anyway. Now, so we've heard about OP bringing benefits to the public sector in the drive to create efficiencies and release land for house building. But for me, there's a huge overlap between the work of OP in the public sector and actually the role that the private sector can play in driving some of this development. A couple of people have mentioned it now, but if you take town centre regeneration, for example, huge part of the levelling up agenda. And I personally see huge potential for one public estate to really engage in how high streets and town centres are reimagined now. One of the big challenges with town centres is how do you bring a viable mix of uses together that can promote an increase in footfall and keep thriving town centres. And by bringing a group of public sector bodies together, that can act as a real catalyst to achieve just that. The principle of shared services or service hubs can act as a real catalyst and an anchor to schemes. That not only do they bring much needed facilities together and facilitate, the public sector as the forward face of these schemes, but it drives footfall, which is all about adding to the viability of these town centres. And, the example I just talked about in Oxford is doing just that. The scheme we're working on there is at the end of a high street, and it's really focused on bringing health onto the high street, which not only is it going to diversify the football in an area that's predominantly student dominated, but it's going to make sure that the community hub is at the heart of that high street, and so there's wider benefits that come into that. I think if you take all of those aspects, combine that with a suitable residential offering, the right retail mix, suitable commercial space, and equally as important, a functional, usable, green and open space. There's a regeneration scheme that not only does it revitalise the town centre, but it makes sure public services at the front of that, and that can really drive confidence from a private sector perspective as well. Another great example there is the redevelopment we worked on in Pontypridd town centre, where we delivered a scheme with the council that brought leisure centre, library and workspace for both the council and Transport for Wales together, alongside the existing retail offer in the town centre. And it's really helped to revitalise that area of the town. So there's just a case in point about how public sector service can drive town centre regeneration. Now, we probably couldn't go through a session like today without mentioning some of the fiscal challenges that are faced by the public sector. As a business, we do a lot of work in partnership with local authorities, and through the fiscal challenges that don't need to go into detail, quite well promoted around revenue challenges, capital spend and things like that. I think we've started to see a little bit where short-term fiscal needs are sometimes overriding some of the longer-term planning gains that can be had. As an example, we've been working with a couple of authorities over recent times to deliver a couple of developments that would have served as not only regenerating the community, but also adding a revenue stream for those authorities. However, through budget pressures, probably exacerbated through COVID, a couple of those schemes have been cancelled, and authorities have chosen to sell lands on an isolated basis. Now, that's not criticism, that's helped to solve what has been a short-term capital issue. But for me, it's not solving the longer-term revenue pressure that authorities are seeing. So from my perspective, I'd really urge, authorities who are considering selling a site on an isolated basis to first think about how one public estate could promote a slightly more strategic conversation. So that there's a view on the longer term benefits that can be had from co-locating and how that could help better serve your asset base. And as Wareham Dixon, we're here to support that. We're working with a number of parties, and we're more than happy to provide advice and support from a private sector perspective. So I suppose just for me to finish before we jump into the Q&A, I suppose from a private sector perspective, we see the huge benefits that the OP programme is bringing to the public sector. But as a private sector, we really do feel we've got a lot of value that we can add to that to make sure schemes are delivered with a commercial and a market edge, and briefs are brought together in a proactive manner. And we're eager to support those conversations. So I want to say, please engage us in dialogue. We're here to support, help you drive efficiency in your estate, and ultimately accelerate the release of land for house building. So I'll leave it there from my message, Jonathan, and hand over for the Q&A.
Many thanks, Richard. And many thanks to all our panelists. And very nice to see Ellen taking over the share screen, proving central local collaboration at its best. That was very, very nice. Look, many thanks to all our panelists. And what I suggest, Ellen and Kirsty, if you're happy, we'll share a copy of today's presentation for everyone who's registered for today's events. They can get back to you. As we know, it's our job here to encourage dialogue, debate and exchange. Now we've got a few minutes before we wrap up today to delve into the Q&A. I think got one question from the Localis regular, Councillor John Beasley. He asks, probably first best to Kirsty and Ellen, what leverage, John asks, does MHCLG have or use when there's resistance from the public estate to the possible release of land for housing? What bullets do you have in the locker for such overcoming such obstacles?
Shall I start? And Helen can join in. So just as a caveat, I'm not from MHCLG, okay? So please bear that in mind. But I think it's fair to say that it is a challenge across government, and I think that's because we have competing priorities. It's not always about housing, although housing has been a priority for some time. So you have to weigh up the release of land to gain maximum value to reinvest in services within departments against the need to deliver housing. And those things are not necessarily always heading in the same direction. So there is a bit of a tension there. That said, we still need to, and government is committed to, releasing land for housing, both from the central government estate and incentivising and supporting local authorities to do that from local government and more widely across the public sector. So just a few things on that. So there has been a housing task force at a ministerial level for some time. There's also a public sector land for housing programme, and there has been, that set targets to March 2020 and held departments to account for that. We, One Public Estate, actually supported that from the local government side of things, whereby we have been running a survey called the Local Authority Land Ambition to understand how local authorities, or what housing local authorities are delivering and releasing to March 2020. So we are at the moment internally looking at the results of that. It's fair to say that we were a bit more ambitious, both for the local authority and central government target, than has actually been able to be delivered. So absolutely the right question. And I think there's the incentivisation side of things, which is more the sort of carrot and the funding and the ability to consider what the opportunities might be with programmes like One Public Estate. But there's also the, if I can call it, the sort of stick side to the carrot. And that's around holding them to account, having those high-level conversations. I think the opportunity coming down the line is around the spending review, SR21. We've had 1-year spending reviews. We are hopefully, fingers crossed, going to go into a 3-year spending review, and that will give us more opportunity to think about that sort of longer-term pipeline. But I think it's fair to say, and where we definitely play a role in this, is that compromise needs to be developed. So it's not always the case that, let's say, a large MOD site is able to be released for the housing potential that it has, because a local authority in that area might well say that 3,000 homes are not appropriate for that local area. So some kind of compromise needs to be reached in order to effectively get that site away for the housing potential that it can have. And that's where OPE comes in to help some of those conversations between those partners. I'll stop there because I know we're running out of time. I don't know if Alan wants to add anything to that.
I think that was a really comprehensive answer. I think the only thing I'd add is a more general point, which is if one has an impasse in terms of any issue or debate, I think the first thing you need to do is to understand why, because the solution and the approach will be different in every case. So I think that's just the point I would make. The reason for resistance can come from any particular reason. It might be something local, it might be something more structural, etc.
Many thanks, Ellen. Kirsty, we're closing out time now, but briefly ask Michael and then Richard if any sort of final thoughts or comments about either incentives or ways of overcoming barriers to greater use of the public estate. Starting with Michael, if you'd like to, any concluding quick comments.
No, I think just the point that's already been made, that we recognise there is a demand or a risk adverse to releasing land at this particular time, particularly in relation to health and others. But I do think it's important that government has a really clear direction. Cabinet Office can help to do that. Incentives, I think there are some in terms of the funding side, but I think ultimately there needs to be quite clear targets that are met by the departments. That's the way to drive that release.
Thank you, Michael. Richard, final thoughts from you, please, on that issue.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Jonathan. I think from my perspective, I think what's critical across all this, I think, you know, characteristic targets, incentives are all absolutely important, but where the huge blockage comes from, particularly is where there's not that political drive and buy-in. I think without that drive from the top, there's always going to be challenges. So whether that's the leader in the council, the chief executive, I think that's about setting that agenda right at that level. You know, I don't know, probably not on my own insane, but not often do we see problems where, you know, we've got a site that's sat in the general fund and the HRA might want to develop it, but there's got to be some sort of internal consideration on land value and, you know, all, you know, if from a private sector perspective, hopefully not too provocative, but it's all a paper exercise. Ultimately, everyone wants to achieve the same thing and deliver development. If there's that driving from the top, it happens. You know, these barriers are overcome naturally. Part of that is carrot and stick, but ultimately it's about political drive for me.
Fantastic. Well, look, thank you very much, everyone. We're going to call it a wrap now. Firstly, huge thanks to our fantastic panel, Ellen, Kirsty, Michael and Richard. As I said, I'll send off a copy of the presentation to everyone who took part today. Any further questions you want to raise to any of the panelists, come through us at Localis. We'll wrap it up. We're also going to put this presentation on YouTube for anyone who wants to watch later on catch up. So on behalf of everyone at Localis, thank you again to our panelists. Thank you for joining our show, everyone who's registered and signed up for today. And you know, we'll hopefully be carrying the can forward with future building for renewal webinars. And Kirsty, my main thanks to you. The hope that there will be an SR21. You know, it's the hope that kills, isn't it? But that's a very hopeful sign. We might get a final long-term, multi-year